If you're painting with an airbrush, learning to paint fire or flames can be a very fun exercise, and you get a very interesting and cool looking painting when you're done with it. So within this video, I'm going to show you all the techniques that I use to paint this one. If you want to paint along with me, up on the left side of the screen is my completed painting, and on the right side I included a 1x1 grid over my painting, so you could use this to draw out your contours or outlines on your panel, paper, or canvas, whatever you choose to work on. Now, rather than tracing or projecting on an image, using a grid is going to be more work for sure. There's no question about that. But the thing that I love about it is that it's a tried and true method used for centuries to help develop your drawing and observation skills. And a huge bonus is that you don't need any extra supplies, no printer, no projector, and no stencils required. I'm painting this one on a 14 by 11 inch birch panel, and I bought these on Amazon. I'll have a link for them down below. It was really cheap. It was like 20 bucks for 4 of them. Really nice practice surface to work on. And then to prep the panel, I applied 2 coats of gesso, wet sanded it with 120 and 220 grit, and then I sprayed over a layer of black paint. And the paint that I used for this was golden high flow acrylics. It's a very strong, durable paint. And then I drew it out using a colored pencil by Prismacolor using a 1x1 grid. That's my favorite technique, but if you like others, if you want to print it out and trace it or use a projector, there's nothing wrong with that. So now I drew out all my contour lines really bright here just for the sake of this video so that you could see what I'm doing. If I was doing this painting just for myself without filming it, I would have used a much lighter pencil and less pressure. But I want these really bright here so you could see all my outlines to see exactly what I'm doing. What I'm using here is 3M vinyl tape. This is 1/8 inch. And you can see that I'm just lining it up with this top curve on the upper right hand side of the painting. Now there's a lot of ways to paint sharp edges with an airbrush, so let's start with the vinyl tape here before moving on to a few of the other techniques. And then you could test them out, try them out for yourself, see which techniques you like to use most in your painting. You could use whatever you'd like or a combination of all of them. The color in my airbrush right now is opaque white. This is Createx Illustration Colors, and I reduce it about 10% with distilled water. I'm spraying right at around 30 psi, maybe a little bit less, 28, 27 or so, just to help atomize that thicker paint a bit easier. And I'm spraying this paint right over and to the left of that vinyl tape. The reason that I'm using a shield is just to prevent overspray from getting to the right side of the panel. The very nice thing about vinyl tape is that you could apply it to pretty much any curve and conform it to match that curve perfectly. So once I have this painted down, I can remove it, and you'll see that on the right side, I get a very, very sharp line. And because I was able to apply this tape right over my drawing, it matches the drawing perfectly. For this curve underneath, which is kind of like a crescent shape, I'm using a freehand shield, and I'm just lining it up with the edge of the area that I just painted in. I'll spray some paint down and you can see how much quicker it goes with a freehand shield. Either option is just fine to get a sharp edge in, whatever you're more comfortable with. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's different edges. There's a variation between them. Some of them are very sharp and some are soft. And I'm constantly thinking about that as I'm painting this one. So anytime I see something sharp, I'm going to use some sort of shield, some tape, or some frisket film. And then when I want an area softer, just kind of blending into the background like this area right here, I'm going to let the airbrush do that work for me. I'm just going to lightly dust on the paint, and as I get into the darker area, I'm just going to spray less. If you look at my completed painting, I'm painting this area right here, and you'll notice that there's a sharp edge on the top and the bottom of this line. So I use that 3M vinyl tape for the top part, spray some paint over that. That's going to give me the sharp line. And then for the one at the bottom, I'll just use a freehand shield here. Just kind of line it up and lightly spray over it. And then instead of taping off the background behind that vinyl tape, I'm just using my shield to prevent overspray. And in this area where it starts to curve away from that tape, I'll use a shield. Just kind of place that over and just make one continuous line. And now for the area underneath, this part of the flame right here, there's a sharp edge at the bottom of it. And then it kind of just fades up. It gets a little bit softer and there's a gradient in here. So as I spray this in, I want to direct that paint over the shields, giving me that sharp edge, and then just let some of that overspray dust its way up to give that softer transition. And you'll notice that this shield doesn't fit the curve perfectly. That's no big deal. I could just spray small parts at a time. Spray a little bit, just kind of adjust the shield, and then spray some more. And then for the area in the center here, it's pretty soft, so I'm just going to let the airbrush do the work. I'm just going to lightly spray some paint in this area, spraying a little bit less toward the bottom so it fades, so we get a bit of gradient into that dark black background. Now when I did this, you'll notice that I didn't use a shield to block off the other side of the tape. So when I remove the tape, you're going to see some overspray. You're going to see kind of like a halo or a ghosting effect of that tape. When you paint with an airbrush, overspray is a natural thing. It's always going to happen, and overspray really has a way of finding its way across all parts of the canvas. It could really move around. But fortunately for this painting, the background is a solid color. It's just black, so I'm not going to be fighting it the whole time. If some overspray gets back there, it's not going to be a big deal because I could switch right back over to that black, spray it over, and just make it disappear. I'm going to have to do that anyway in this painting to cover up all my grid lines. I'm going to have to paint over them, so it's not going to be that big of a deal for me. But if that background was complicated, stuff that I had to paint in, just imagine like a whole scene behind this fire, I'd have to cover all that up because any overspray is going to ruin that area, an area that I'd have to repaint. So this one is just going to be a lot more forgiving with that solid black background. So I added some more vinyl tape for this curve underneath, and then I used some blue painter's tape just to mask off the area underneath it. Now, if you notice what I'm doing here, I'm only painting in small parts of the grid at a time. I'm not thinking of the whole painting. I'm trying to simplify it for myself, because if I think to myself that I have to paint in all of these curves and all of these transitions, gradients all in one shot, I'm going to get overwhelmed. So all I'm doing here is just pretending I'm painting a tiny painting, just a small area up here within these two boxes. Everything else below it, all the flames below this area, are not even in my mind right now. I just want to start painting in this area. So let's continue along, adding in a few more of these edges using a freehand shield. Now, if you don't have a freehand shield, you can make your own using paper. All you need to do is take an X-Acto blade or a utility blade and just cut a few curves in the paper. And as you can see here, my shield is not fitting any of these curves absolutely perfectly. That's just fine. It really doesn't matter. I just want to get it close. And so if you make your own shields out of paper, it's going to work exactly the same. You'll notice that it's not going to fit your line drawing absolutely perfectly, but you can get it really close if you just kind of move it around. For a few of these softer lines like this one right here, I'll just paint it in freehand, but if it looks like it needs to be a little bit sharper in some areas, I'll just come in with my shield and dust on a small amount of paint. And you can see what I get with that. It's still a soft line, but it has a very subtle sharpness at the bottom. These two flames at the top here kind of form together and form a sharp point at the top, so I'll just lay my shield over it, spray in a bit of paint. And so now for the majority of this painting, I'll just continue using freehand shields and some 3M vinyl tape. And the reason for that is because I can get those sharp lines in quickly and pretty accurate to my initial drawing. But another tool that I love to use is frisket film. It works great. You can lay it right over the painting, cut into it, and get very, very accurate edges. So let me show you a quick example of how I would use this to paint in this very small flame on the top right of the painting. The frisket film that I'm using here is made by Art Tool. It's a matte frisket film that comes in a roll, but I'm not picky with this. I'll use any frisket that I can get. As long as I'm using a fresh, sharp X-Acto blade, I'll have no issues cutting into this because I'm always painting on a very durable surface, either a canvas that has a bunch of gesso on it or a panel like I'm doing here. And the nice thing about that is that I never need to worry about damaging the surface that I'm working on. So I'll start directing the paint here toward the edges to give me that sharp line. And I notice that there's kind of a softer line down the center here. So I'll just paint that in freehand and I'll just kind of dust in some paint within the center here. Now, one thing with frisket is that it's always going to give you very, very sharp lines like you can see here when I remove it. And frisket is going to be very similar to that 3M vinyl tape. Those lines are always going to be razor sharp. With a freehand shield, you're going to get a little bit more control. Sometimes I'll just slightly lift that shield off the surface, like a 1/2 millimeter up, and then dust on a thin amount of paint. That way I'm still going to get a sharp line, but it's going to be a little bit softer than what I would get from frisket or vinyl tape. So at this point, I'm going to start adding some color just to show you how we're going to shift it from this black and white painting to that color of fire, to that orange and red. I'll be using 3 transparent colors here: scarlet, orange, and yellow. The darkest color is going to be scarlet, which is a red. That's the color that's in my airbrush right now. I'm using scarlet right out of the bottle. And what I'm doing here is I'm not just blindly trying to spray it over this whole area. Instead, what I'm trying to do is focus some of this red into the shadows just to kind of blend this white paint into the black background. And because this color is transparent, I'm not concerned if any of it gets in the black background because a transparent color can only get darker. Since that background is black, which is the darkest value that you can get out of a paint, nothing's going to happen if a small amount of this red gets in there. You're not even going to notice it. So now let's talk about some basic color theory. When you spray a white opaque color over an existing color with an airbrush, you're going to get a blue-gray shift. And what that means is the hue underneath is going to shift toward a blue or a gray. And so another way to think about this is that that white color that we sprayed down is going to act like a blue-white. So you can see here as I spray some of this red into the shadows, that color is kind of shifting toward a red-violet, just like it would with a blue color. Another reason for this is that the black that I'm using here, which is a carbon black, is a cooler black, so it's going to almost act like a blue. So that means that we have two colors on the panel right now, that white, which is titanium dioxide, and that carbon black, which is carbon, both of which have a bias toward blue. So one of the easiest ways to negate this and kind of push back that blue shift is to use the complementary color to blue, which is orange. So what I did here was sprayed a light amount of transparent orange over the top of this, right over the shadows and the midtones, small amount in the highlights, and that'll help knock down some of that blue shift. And you'll see later when we spray some white directly over these colors, that blue-gray shift is going to be very dramatic. And so I sprayed a small glaze of that yellow into the highlights, and you can see right up here in this area that I'm circling, it shifted a little bit toward green. And of course, that's because if you mix the color yellow and blue, you get the color green. So we have a little shift here. We'll adjust that later. It's no big deal. So that's the techniques that I'm going to be using as I work my way down to paint in the rest of the flame. White to get in those bright highlights and the midtones. And then I'll be using 3 transparent colors to spray over the top: scarlet, orange, and yellow. As I work my way down here, I'm doing what I talked about before. I'm just focusing on one small part of the painting at a time. I'm not trying to rush and get the whole thing painted in. I'm just working down into this next square, starting at the top, moving my way down, painting one little bit of the flame at a time. I see a sharp edge on the right here, so I use some vinyl tape, and a sharp edge on the left, so I used a shield for that. In the center, where it's a bit softer, I'm going to paint it in freehand. And I drew up my lines very bright here so you could see what I'm doing. These lines really act like a cheat sheet for me. I could see exactly where the flames, where the edges are going to start and where they're going to stop. Like this curve right here, I'm going to line up a piece of vinyl tape right over my drawing and spray in that sharp edge. And at this point in the early stages of any painting, this is the weird or the awkward phase where nothing looks right. A lot of times this is where people give up. Sometimes we'll start to think here that this looks nothing like what the final painting is supposed to look like. But you just have to remember to trust in the process, trust what you're seeing, and keep working your way down. Pay attention to what you see and try to replicate it. If an edge looks sharp, that's where you use a tool like a shield or some tape to help you out. If it looks softer, paint it in freehand. Just remember that every single painting or drawing is always going to look weird in the early stages. That's part of the process. So going back to the painting, you'll notice here that some of my areas are a little bit too bright. I sprayed too much white paint. Very common, simple little mistake, no big deal. It's really easy to fix. I'll just switch back over to that color black and then just spray it into the areas that are a little bit too bright. While I'm doing this, I can also soften up some of those edges, add some gradients to make it look like some of the fire is just blending into that black background. And you'll see that's what I'm doing in some areas here, just kind of spraying into that black background and letting the overspray just kind of drift up onto the white. I'll also clean up some of these edges and some of the overspray with some black paint, just spraying it into the background. And then I'm going to go back to those 3 transparent colors. I'm going to start with the orange here instead of the red, and I'll just start kind of like in the shadows, spraying some of that paint in, and then just trying to cover up all the white here with that orange paint. When you spray a transparent color like this over an existing color, this is called a glaze. A glaze like this is going to shift the color or the hue, and it's also going to darken up the value. So sometimes when you're spraying the color white, it's best to spray it a little bit brighter, add some more of that paint, because when you add the glaze over the top, that transparent color, it's going to knock down some of that value. So let's keep working our way down, adding a few more of these flames in, and I'll start here using some of that 3M vinyl tape. Now, taping over thin layers of airbrush paint can be tricky. Sometimes it lifts up, but it's another reason that I really like painting on gesso. Gesso kind of holds that paint in. You could tape over it all day. Nothing's going to happen to it. You do want to make sure that you give it some time to dry though. If you just place it on, put tape on top, within a minute or so, it's going to lift up. But if you just give it about 10 to 20 minutes to dry, doesn't need to fully cure, you could tape right over the top of it. No clear coat needed. And the paint that I'm using for this part is Createx Illustration colors, and you can see I'm not having any issues taping over the top of it. If you're working on a different type of substrate or surface, it's always best to test it out. Whether it's a test panel or an extra sheet of paper, try taping over it, see if that paint holds or lifts up. But if you're painting on a gessoed surface, whether it's canvas, panel, or paper, you're always painting on top of the gesso. The substrate underneath just becomes the surface to hold the gesso. And the nice thing about that is that it really doesn't matter what the surface is, what that substrate is underneath, it's always going to feel like the same texture. And with a gessoed surface, you could use frisket film, even high tack frisket film. You could tape over it, vinyl tape, any sort of tape. You could do it all day long. It's never going to lift up as long as you let that paint dry. So as I work my way down here, you can see I'm using a homemade freehand shield, and I'm using the exact same techniques, using that opaque white by Createx Illustration Colors, focusing in here on the shapes that I see, the sharp edges and the softer ones. And I'm always following my initial drawing. That's always going to be my guide. In some areas here, I sprayed in too much white paint or the edges were a bit too sharp, so just like before, I'm going to go back to that black paint and just kind of soften everything up and knock down some of the value. Once that's done, I'm going to go back to my 3 transparent colors. I'll start first with that red, that scarlet color, and I'll start spraying that into the shadows. I don't want to go crazy with this red color. I'm just focusing it into the shadows, just a small amount, a subtle amount of this red. And then over to the transparent orange, I'm using this right out of the bottle, and this I'm going to spray pretty much over the entire area, an even coat. I'll try to spray a bit more of this into the shadows, and then as I get into the highlights, into the brighter areas, I'll try to spray a little bit less. And then finally right here, I'm going over to that transparent yellow, and I'm really focusing this into the highlights. I'm spraying a good amount of this paint in there, and you can see that it kind of lifts up some of the value. A lot of yellows are more of a semi-transparent color than a full transparent, because if you keep spraying them and building up the value, you'll notice that it'll start to get lighter. It's one of the few transparent colors that does that. That's why I consider it more of a semi-transparent, because it will build up some opacity the more you spray. And when I was working on this flower painting a few months back, I actually used that to my advantage. I needed a green color up here toward the top for some of these out of focus buds in the background. And so instead of mixing a semi-opaque green to paint this in, I decided to use that transparent yellow. And so I just sprayed this in, just kind of building up a few layers, and you can clearly see that it definitely builds up some opacity and lightens the area. And since the color underneath this is black, which is a cooler, bluer tone, when that yellow mixes with it, we get a green. This yellow paint is a transparent color, there's no question about that, but you just need to be a little bit careful with it, because if you spray too much or you build up too much overspray over that black paint, you're going to start to notice that it will shift toward green. So we just need to be careful with that. If it does happen, it's no big deal. We could use some orange or some of that red to knock down that green shift. So going back to the painting, let's just keep working our way down. I'll mask off the right side of this vinyl tape with some blue painter's tape just to prevent any overspray from getting to the right in the area that I painted. And now to paint in this very thin flame, which is kind of like a triangle shape, I'll use a freehand shield for the left side of it. And for the sharp edge on the right side, that vinyl tape is doing the work for me. I placed that down so I could just focus my shield on the left side of this for some of these sharper edges. And like always, I'm using that shield just to define the sharper edges, and then anything in the center that needs to be softer, that's where I work freehand. There's a few small flames, some flickers along the outside of this painting. So to paint these in, I'm going to use a piece of 3M vinyl tape. I'll just place it at the bottom of this one in the center, and then I'll use a shield to define the upper part of it. The rest I'll spray in freehand. So we get sharp at the bottom, and then as it moves along to the right, it just gets a little bit softer toward the top right of it. As I move along to the right, there's a strange shape in here. It almost looks like a box or a square. And I wouldn't think that a shape like this would be in fire, but I see it in my reference. So if I see it there, I'm going to try to paint it. And for this style of painting, there's nothing wrong with inventing things and making things up to make it your own. But for me personally, I'm always paying attention to what I see rather than what I think I know about the painting. Because what's interesting about that is you're going to learn so much about whatever it is you're painting. There's always new stuff to see and to observe. Now in this area, I noticed that there's some thin lines of fire, almost like some thin streaks of red and some orange. So what I'm going to do here is use a piece of frisket film, and I just cut out a curve in it. Now I'll try to line this up with my initial drawing. It's not going to fit it perfectly, but that's just fine. And I'll just leave a bit of a gap between the two pieces here of the frisket film. Toward the top of the frisket, I brought the two edges a little bit closer together so it comes to a sharp point, and then I'll just spray this white paint within that gap. And when I remove it, you can see we just get a nice thin line. Now, you don't need to use frisket film for this. You could use a piece of paper, cut out a curve, do the same thing. The nice thing about frisket is that it's transparent or semi-transparent, so you could see what you're doing. You could see exactly where you're laying it over your painting. But you can get the exact same results using a piece of paper or even some 3M vinyl tape. I'll add a few more of these streaks that I see within this part of the painting, and then I'll use the color black, and I'll just kind of start spraying this around the outside, cover up some of those grid lines, and also to soften up some of the edges. And then from here, I'm going to go right back over to those transparent glazes. I'll start with that scarlet. When I spray that on, we get a red effect, but you can see it just shifts a little bit toward a violet because of that blue. So to fix that, it's very simple. We're going to use the color orange. I'm going to glaze this over the top, over the whole area. Orange is the complementary color to blue, so it's going to knock down any of that blue shift, any of that violet color is going to get knocked back to a reddish orange. For example, you can see down here, this part of the flame that I'm circling has kind of a magenta look to it, has a bit of a violet shift. So to negate some of that blue shift, which turned that red violet, I have to use the complementary color to violet, which is going to be yellow. I could use the transparent orange, or I could use the transparent yellow. Orange has yellow in it, right? Orange is a mixture of red and yellow. So a thin glaze of transparent orange in this area is just going to help knock down some of that blue shift, just going to kill some of that violet purple color that we're seeing. Now, I used grids in my painting because that's just one of my favorite techniques, so I'm going to have to clean them up here. So what I'm doing is using some of that golden carbon black and just kind of cleaning up the background. I'm just cleaning up some overspray, spraying some of this paint over it, and focusing some of this paint over those lines just to make them disappear. If it looks a little splotchy, you know, some areas may look a bit matte, some may look a little bit glossy. Easy to fix. I'll do that at the end of the painting. So like I said before, when you spray a glaze over an existing color, it's always going to darken up the value. So what I want to do is bring back some more of the highlights into this area. Normally I'm erasing into the paint, but for this one I'm using a different technique. I'm using opaque colors. So what I'm going to do here is use that opaque paint. This is Createx Illustration Opaque White. I have it reduced about 10% with distilled water, and I'm just going to focus this over the highlights. You'll notice when I do this that the blue shift is pretty obvious here. We're painting over an orange color, so a lot of these kind of get grayed out. That's normal. It's not a big deal. We could easily fix it with some glazes later on, but you'll see here that I'm just focusing the opaque white in the areas that I want to be brighter within the highlights. I'm doing the best I can to try to minimize some overspray from the white paint. Like I said before, it's still going to find its way in areas that you don't want it to be. So I'm trying to do the best I can with my shield to block off areas where I don't want this white paint. And you can clearly see that blue shift here of spraying that opaque white over these existing colors. And the color shift that we're getting here is much more toward gray because the blue from the white mixing with that orange underneath, those are complementary colors, so it's going to move toward gray. Or another way to think about it is that these highlights are shifting more toward a cooler temperature. So I'll just speed through some of this because it's really just doing the same thing that we did before. But this time, instead of spraying in all of the flames, I'm just focusing that white paint in the areas that I want to be brighter within those highlights. And one of my favorite ways or tricks to see values easier is just to squint my eyes. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen and you squint your eyes, you'll notice that the detail just kind of fades away. You're not able to see that. But what you are able to see is areas of light and dark. And when you do that, you could really see the areas that need to be brighter. So at this point, all the highlights are in, so it's time to start adding the glaze. I'm going to start with the color orange. It's important with this orange color to add a thin glaze over all of the areas that you painted in white to minimize that blue shift. If you don't get a thin glaze of that orange over the white, the blue is still going to be there. So I'm going to show you an example here of what happens if you switch over to that yellow without the orange underneath. So I'm spraying that transparent yellow right now, and you can see some areas of the white that I left out. When the yellow goes over that white, which is a bluish white, it's going to shift toward a green because blue and yellow give you green. So what I like to do is make sure that I get a thin glaze of that orange over everything before adding the yellow down. That's just really going to help minimize that blue shift. And because the color we're using here is yellow, it doesn't look like a blue shift anymore. It looks like a green shift. So if you notice this happening in your painting, when you spray some yellow over the top, you start seeing a green shift. There's nothing to worry about. It's really, really easy to fix. The complementary color to green is red. So there's two ways to go about this. We could use red right out of the bottle, just lightly glaze it on. Red tends to get dark pretty quickly, so another way is to use orange. Orange has red in it, right? Orange is a mixture of yellow and red, so a thin glaze of orange will work as well. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now what I want to start doing is adding in the lower part of the flame, just kind of pulling everything together. At the end of the painting, I'm going to come around everything and just kind of clean things up. We could bump up the contrast by adding some more white to bring some areas up, make them brighter. And of course, we could do some color correction, spraying some glazes over the top to shift down any blue or green shift that we're seeing in our painting. You'll notice that some of the lines, some of the edges of the flames kind of overlap each other in a few areas. And that's very, very easy to paint. I'll just lay my shield over an area that I just painted and we'll get a very thin line, a thin highlight overlapping the painting underneath. And so what I'm doing here is the exact same thing I did before, but here I'm just using a larger shield. This one is made by Art Tool. It's called the Bird. I really love this shield. I find myself using it all the time. And I'm just lining it up with all my initial line drawings, spraying in some of those sharp lines. And again, if anything needs to be softer in here, I'll just paint it freehand. So same thing over and over. It's just rinse and repeat. And it doesn't matter what type of flame you're painting. There's all different types of flames. There's dramatic ones like what we're painting here. There's softer ones, like from a lighter or from a candle. It doesn't matter what type of flame you're painting. It's just very important to get a good reference photo, a good clear shot of what you're trying to paint. For this style of painting, that's always going to be my guide. I'm always trying to paint what I see. Once these areas are painted in with white, I'm going to switch over to that color red, the scarlet, and I'm going to start at the top, glazing it over some of that green shift just to knock it down. Remember that red is the complementary color to green, so if you notice some green in it, a small amount of red, just a tiny amount, will help knock that back. Then I'll switch over to that transparent orange, spray a thin amount of this over the entire area. A good amount of that orange is going to shift the hue of the white and knock down any of that blue underneath. And to push back some of that green, I will also add a very thin glaze of that scarlet over the top. And at this point, we can see that it's starting to look like fire, so it's starting to come together. There's still a fair amount of work that I need to do here. The major thing is to start painting in the lower part of the flame, kind of like the base here where it widens out. My drawing is my guide, so I'm just using my large shield like I've done the whole time throughout this painting, just lining it up with my drawing and spraying in these shapes, letting them overlap in a few areas. And for the lower part here where there are a lot of lines that kind of overlap, use any tool that you feel is best or easiest for you. You'll see me switching off between those shields and some of that vinyl tape. There's a lot of overlapping on the lower part here, but it's not difficult. It's exactly like everything else. You just have to take your time, pay attention to what you see, add in your paint, and then compare it to your reference. If anything looks off or you made a major mistake, it's no big deal. You could always go back to the black paint, spray it over the top, start again. Down at the bottom here, there are a few sharper flames, so of course that's a shield, but there's also some softer areas in here, so I'm just going to spray them in freehand right in the center here. Even if you spray in something freehand and it starts to look a little bit too soft, you could always bring your shield to just kind of line up with the edge of it and spray some more paint on. You could sharpen it up that way. And while I'm doing this, you will see me add some of the white into the areas above it, some of the areas that just got a little bit too dark from the glaze. Small amount of white to brighten them up, and then we'll glaze some color over the top. At the bottom, I'm going to take some artistic liberties, as they say, to veer away from the reference photo to make some of these flames a bit more dramatic. A lot of times fire can look very soft in areas where the flame is concentrated, and it could just look a little boring, just some shifts between yellow and orange. So I wanted to make this area look a little bit more interesting from what I was seeing in the reference photo. So I decided to make some of these sharper. And what I'm doing here is just trying to match some of those sharper curves and shapes that we painted in at the top of the flame so that the bottom just has a similar look. For me, painting is always about painting, and there's a lot of fun things that you get to do, experiment, and change that are all in your control. Sometimes that means painting things a little bit softer or more subtle, sometimes a bit more exaggerated like what we're doing here. But above all else, make sure that you're having fun with it, picking subjects or styles that are interesting to you. That way, when you're ready to start your next project, you're excited about it. You have some enthusiasm to really push forward. So let's finish this one up. Right now, everything is in place. What I want to start doing is adding in the highlights. This is going to add some more depth to the painting so it doesn't look flat. Some of these brighter areas are going to look closer, and some of the shadows are going to look like it's fading away. For a few of those embers or flyaway flames, I'm just using a ripped piece of paper and a shield, just spraying a little bit of white paint in there. The edge from the ripped paper will give me a bit of texture so the edge isn't perfectly straight. Just a little bit of white sprayed in there so it's soft, out of focus, almost looks like it's in motion. You'll notice that the white paint that we used to paint in some of the highlights added a pretty dramatic blue-gray shift. So you already know what we're going to need to do to knock it down. We're going to have to use some glazing colors over the top. We're going to use some orange, some red, and some yellow. Before we do that, I noticed that some of the lines down at the bottom were looking a little bit too sharp, so I'm adding one softer line in there, just doing this freehand, and adding a bit of a gradient, spraying some more of the white paint over to the right, a little bit over to the left as well to keep it soft. So now what I want to do is start glazing the colors over the top. I don't want to lose the bright value, and like I said earlier, when you apply a glaze, it's going to darken up an area. So I'm going to start with that yellow color and start glazing this over the entire painting, really focusing a good amount of this yellow onto those highlights. And like I said before, from that white paint, we get a blue shift. So when you spray that yellow over the blue, it's going to shift slightly toward green. And we can see that here. Some of this yellow is just looking a little bit too green. So how do we get rid of that green? It's easy. We just use a complementary color. The complementary color to green is red. So in my airbrush right now, I have a mixture of scarlet and orange. It's like 75% scarlet, 25% orange. And I'm using this to glaze over these areas. I'm spraying a little bit more of this color into those shadows to darken them up, kind of push them toward the background. And as I get into the highlights, I don't want to overdo it. I still want this color on to neutralize that green shift, but I'm just spraying a small amount into the highlights. The way that I'm doing this is just dusting on that reddish color over the highlights until I see the green start to disappear. I'm not looking to see any sort of red. And like everything in drawing or painting, it's always best to go slow. That's always my recommendation. There's no need to rush. It's not a race. So when I'm applying a glaze like this, I'll just apply a very small amount, just a dusting of that paint. Then I'll step back from the painting, look at it from a few feet away, see if I need to add more. And finally, for the last thing in this painting, I'm switching over to the color Scarlet, using this right out of the bottle. And I'll start at the bottom in the darker areas, spraying a good amount of this paint in there, just to kind of darken it up and add some more saturation, make it look like a bright, deep red. And what I was doing here was stepping back from my painting a few feet back and just trying to spot any areas that had shifted toward green because of that yellow. The smallest amount of this red paint over any green is just going to help neutralize it, make it look more natural, make it look like fire. I'll clean up any of my grid lines using that carbon black paint, just spray it right over them, and I will use a shield to just kind of sharpen up some edges of the flame and prevent any overspray from that black paint getting on that orange. And then that's it. This is the final painting in some more natural light so we don't have any glare on it. What I'm doing here is applying a permanent satin varnish over the top of it, just spraying it on pretty lightly. That'll even up any of that blotchiness within the black paint. So I really hope that you enjoyed this one, maybe picked up a thing or two, and I wish you nothing but the best in your own paintings. Before I go, I want to say thank you so much to the generous and kind support of the current channel members. I'd like to welcome the newest members, Petri, Yos, Kirk, Meanders Art. Thank you all so much for joining and welcome. And of course, thank you so much to the generous support of the current channel members who have been members for months, even years at this point. I can't thank you guys enough. Thank you. You guys really help keep this channel going, and I have nothing but appreciation for it. I hope everyone has a great week. Best of luck in your paintings. Keep on working. Keep on practicing. I'll see you back here next Friday.